Los panaderos was a trendy musical dance in Spain in the 19th century. They probably arrived from Mexico, where they were danced 2.5 centuries ago and became a very popular flamenco palo and somehow never disappeared. In episode 32 of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, I will talk about the panaderos. You will be able to listen to some of them, and I will tell you how you can find some traces of the panaderos in today's flamenco.
Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. And yet, there is still something we can do for them. Let us summon them. Let us summon them.
Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo, and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces, and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco. Hello again to episode 32 of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, in which we are going to talk about another of those palos that were part of flamenco at some time and that fell into disuse to the point to practically disappearing from the current flamenco scene. And I say almost because in this case it does not happen like with the jarabe, for example, as we saw in the second episode of this podcast. I am referring to the panaderos, that in some way is still alive in flamenco. By the way, the word panaderos means bakers. But first, let me remind you how important is it that you subscribe to this podcast and became part of this community of people who like history and music and how daily life was in past times. You can do it in the leading podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados del Flamenco Creativa. To find the first references to the panaderos, we must go to Mexico again. Almost 15 years ago, I decided to go to Mexico given the transcendental importance of the music of this country to understand how flamenco was formed. And let's say that I practically stayed there. I used to spend some time every year in this country continuing the research. One of the topics I have researched is the panaderos, that is still performed in different regions of Mexico. It is a live sound that has a lot of musical resemblance to the panaderos who came to Spain. Well, it was the year 1779 when in an inquisitorial file dated March the 2nd, so 245 years ago, it is mentioned for the first time the panaderos, that was a dance where a man and a woman alternatively came out dancing and singing. The file comes from Celaya in Guanajuato. I'm going to read a fragment of it where it describes what the panaderos consisted of. Every people that attends the fandango comes out to dance, still always accompanied by a man and a woman, and staying in their assigned positions, they dance and sing. Everybody goes out to do something. It began with a demon who had already left in form of a woman who came from Valladolid and left this bad seat zone. Well, Valladolid refers to a city in Mexico. The ecclesiastical authorities were not fond of men interacting with women and singing and dancing. Unfortunately, no musical evidences of these panaderos has reached us. Probably the panaderos arrived to Spain from Mexico at the end of the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th century, just as happened with other Mexican songs such as the pan de jarabe, the bejuquito, the morena, the petenera, or the jarabe, among others. And I say probably because there is still a lot of research to be done on this topic. In Spain, los panaderos became one of the most famous stage dances in the mid-19th century and was included in many bailables. The bailables were works that told a story by performing several dances. Look, in 1851, I found panaderos included in the following bailables: La cigarrera de Sevilla, Los marineros de Cádiz, Un día de toros en el puerto de Santa María, El rumbo macareno, or Frasquilla y el Macareno. The following year, the panaderos appears in these works: Las mozas juncales, Curra la Macarena, La feria de Sevilla, El tío carando en las máscaras, or La flamenca. In the rest of the 1850s, we also found it frequently in many bailables. As you can see from the title of these works, these dances usually had Andalusian themes and contained dances typical of that land. In fact, at that time there was a variant of panaderos called panaderos de Cádiz, panaderos from Cádiz. It was also widespread to find panaderos later in works of the género chico and the género ínfimo, such as Una tiple de café, Cádiz, Monomanía musical, Viva Andalucía, Caramelo, Chateau Margaux, A ti suspiramos, Ole Sevilla, El Arca de Noé, La banda de trompetas, Agua, azucarillos y aguardientes, La golfemia, El tío de Alcalá, La corrida de toros, El arte de ser bonita or La mesonera de Tordesillas, among others. We are going to listen to one of these panaderos, specifically the content in the zarzuela El arte de ser bonita, that translated is The Art of Being Pretty, by Jerónimo Jiménez. Panaderos began to be considered a musical expression of flamenco, specifically in its dance and concert guitar aspects, in the second half of the 19th century. An example of this can be found in a story from a journalist from Cádiz, José Velázquez y Sánchez, where the protagonist is a cattle dealer called Uncle Moneva. The author describes him as I read literally. Gypsy of both lines and native of Puerto de Santa María in Cádiz, and who sings, as the local people say, soleares and playeras very well. In addition to singing this musical expression typical of flamenco of that time, he also comments that he danced the panaderos and played the jarabe on the guitar this way. To complement this special modus vivendi, Uncle Moneva danced the zapateado or panaderos, he plays seguidillas and jarabe on the guitar. Although this story does not necessarily describe actual events, what is interesting is that the panaderos dance is linked to flamenco and practiced by people outside the artistic life and performing spaces. It is also significant that, as we saw previously, the writer Benito Masiprat classified Andalusian dance in 1882 and included panaderos within the group of the called flamenco dances. Now we are going to listen to a panadero from that period, included in the medley of Andalusian airs titled La Gloria de Andalucía, translated The Glory of Andalusia, composed by Manuel del Castillo. The peculiarity of these panaderos is that they begin in the minor mode and later change to major mode, which is the characteristic of this musical expression. It was also common for panaderos to be a concert guitar piece, and the great guitarists of the second half of the 19th century composed panaderos, for example, Tomás Damas, Julián Arcas, Julián Parga, or Luis de Soria. Rafael Marín also includes panaderos in his flamenco guitar method from 1902, where it appears in the section To Accompany Dancing. In the 20th century, several flamenco guitarists recorded panaderos, including Paco de Lucía. My guitar teacher, Maestro Castaño from Castiblanco de los Arroyos in Seville, taught his disciple the panaderos, therefore in some way the panaderos is still alive in today's flamenco. It hasn't disappeared, and it is a living fossil of the 19th century Spanish musical life and flamenco. I would also like to comment that the panaderos music was transformed through the 19th century, and an excellent example of this transformation is the piece we are listening to now. These panaderos are included in the collection Trozos Flamencos, published in Seville by the composer Enriqueta Ventura de Domènech around 1880. Let's listen to it and notice if it sounds familiar to you. As you have probably noticed, the current flamenco play of alegrías took up this way of playing panaderos that became fashionable in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Therefore, where you hear a guitar or piano or any other instrument playing alegrías, remember that in some way you are also listening to those panaderos of the 19th century. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please share it with other people who might also like it and subscribe to it on your favorite podcast platform. I'll wait for you here in 15 days with new stories about this amazing 19th century flamenco.